Now live on Facebook, and rolling. We can.
Ready when you are.
Cool. All right. Welcome everybody to the final day of our community democracy webinar series. I am Josh Eisenfeld, our marketing director, and just gonna, before we get started, I want to go over some housekeeping tips. Pardon me as I let one person in from the waiting. So we're going to be recording this live stream, recording and live streaming this webinar. So if you are, uncomfortable with that, now would be the time to log off. And we ask that you stay on mute while you're on the webinar with us. If you're on your phone, that's *6. Please, also, if you're having any issues with your playback, the easiest way to deal with that would be to turn off your video to increase your bandwidth. And there will be a Q&A session at the end of this. So if you have any questions, just you can drop me a line in the chat. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat function. You can send it directly to me, or you could also send it to the main chat, and I'll see it there as well. Also, the other option is if you wait till the end, you can either raise your hand, and I will see that you want to be called on, or you can just unmute yourself and start talking. This is going to be a very conversational Q&A, so feel free to participate however you can. And I don't think there will be any links along the way, so there won't be any of that in the chat. But yeah, that's the housekeeping tips. A little bit about our organization. Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services is a nonprofit environmental law firm that provides access to justice for people and their environment. And we do that by providing legal services on an income basis throughout the Appalachian Basin of Ohio and Pennsylvania, and soon West Virginia. And we do all of that, but we also feel like it's our duty to go beyond the courtroom. And that's part of why we're here today, is to provide support and tools for community leaders like yourselves so that you can make decisions in your neighborhoods. Today, our 5th and final day of this community democracy series will be hosted by our executive director, Emily Collins. And Emily, for those of you that don't know, is the founder and the executive director of our organization. And pardon me one moment. She hails from Tuscarora County, Ohio, and I didn't want to get that wrong. Did I say that right, Emily?
No.
Nope.
But
Good.
I'll say it later.
Great. Emily has spent her entire legal career in environmental law practice and teaching. Emily enjoys ultramarathon running, cycling, skiing, woodworking, farming, gardening, and if that's not enough, spending as much time as possible with her pups, Bruno and Isa. Before I pass it off to Emily, I just want to give you a few ways to get in contact with us. You can go to our website and the Contact Us page, or you could sign up for our newsletter and stay in touch that way. We're here for you however you might need it. There are tons of ways on our website to get in contact with us if neither of those work as well. And as always, we cannot do this without support from folks like you. So thank you for being here and showing your support. And if you have the ability to, we'd love for you to visit our donation page and make a contribution today. So with all that said, the part you've all been waiting for, the way to actually say where Emily is from. Emily, I will pass it off to you.
All right. Thank you, Josh. So I am going to work to share my screen. And is that working, Josh?
That is great.
Okay, perfect. So yes, my name is Emily Collins, and I'm from Tuscarawas County, Ohio. You're so close, Josh, and it's okay. No one gets it, and it's a mark of pride that we all can say it and you all can't. So I really appreciate you all tuning in. And the only thing I'll add to Josh's very, very good bio is that I also sit on the board of a farmer's market called the Haymaker Farmers Market in Kent, Ohio. And I think that's been extraordinarily helpful for me in understanding some of the issues that small family farms face, especially in thinking through revenue, potential revenue streams and how to diversify those streams. So that's the basis of the presentation that I'm giving today. It has to do with a recognition that there are a lot of small family farms out there that are thinking through how to potentially make a profit, if any. And the methods of doing that don't always rely on strictly agricultural production. So I'm going to focus on that a little bit today, on specifically something called agritourism. So Josh already told you about Fair Shake, and I'm grateful for him doing that. The only thing I'll add is that Fair Shake is certainly a place where you can obtain legal services, meaning you can come to us for counsel and advice and dispute resolution. But we're trying to, as Josh mentioned, go beyond that and help clients before they would potentially, make a desperate call for help to us. So that involves the planning process, I think. And that's why I'm so excited to be able to give you a presentation that deals with planning and averting conflict. So this is pre-dispute, hopefully. So I'll leave it at that for who we are and what we do. Also, I always hate disclaimers because they feel so dismissive of the conversation you're about to have with the presenter. But I do need to ask you to just take a step back for a second and think about the information that you're about to receive. Of course, it doesn't apply to your specific situation because you have a specific situation. So I'm giving you, I want to acknowledge that you're all likely in a very different place within the realm of agricultural entrepreneurship. For some of you, I would think it's an idea, it's a dream, right? And for some of you, you've probably already built a business and you're considering changes and how you can do better. Some of you may have already started up what's considered agritourism, and maybe you don't even know it. So that could be the boat that you're in. In any scenario, I expect everyone to be in different places. And this presentation is one that gives you a path forward, but it doesn't necessarily give you the best path for your particular circumstances. So I want to acknowledge with this disclaimer that I'm a lawyer. I'm not representing you specifically by virtue of this presentation, but if you want individualized assistance, there are lots of resources that we could connect you with, including seeking planning assistance from a lawyer that deals with your particular circumstances. And a general presentation like this one, of course, cannot be that. But please follow up on this presentation with requests for that kind of assistance if that is what you need. So that's my best version of a non-dismissive disclaimer for you. All right, so let's kick this off. In the US, over the last 2 decades, small family farms derived about 90% of their household income from off-farm income. So namely, that means jobs that are not farming or even farming related. And you guys know how this goes. So one person in the family is going to go off to work every day and bring home an income from that job instead of being on farm and developing revenue through farm production. But there are some options to diversify revenue, of course, from the foundation of an agricultural resource. and directly for agricultural purposes, such as diversifying products on the farm itself. So of course you could do that. And I think that's traditionally something that people do try to do on the farm. You could diversify farm stand products to include agricultural goods that were not produced on the farm where the farm stand exists. And I've seen some really great instances of this in Northeast Ohio happening, and happening very well during the pandemic, which is kind of exciting and a bit of a silver lining for our current circumstances. And of course, sharing your agricultural expertise and getting paid for it, which we could call consulting, that's an option for generating additional revenue. But farmers and lawmakers have acknowledged that a dramatic need exists for on-farm diversification activity, including entrepreneurial use of a farm or agricultural resource that doesn't necessarily have an agricultural purpose. So the results are commercial gain for the farmer, but the purpose isn't necessarily agricultural. And that's what agritourism is all about. So the incentive that lawmakers have given to farmers for that kind of revenue diversification, it all falls under this heading known as agritourism. And states have passed what's known as agritourism laws to allow uses of a farm for non-agricultural enterprises with the goal of bringing in revenue to support a baseline level of agricultural production. So you still get agricultural production, but your revenue sources might be much, much more diverse in terms of use of the farm. So that's the diversification opportunity that I'm going to focus on today. Okay, so what is agritourism? I'm going to go through what agritourism is in 3 different states: Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And you're going to notice that they're quite different. So that can be problematic, but the reason I want to bring it to your attention is because it means that you need to pay very close attention in the planning process to what your state's law says. So each state is going to define it differently. You'll note some states are willing to allow very broad categories of on-farm activities, and some are much more restrictive. Some people would like to call that anti-regulation states versus regulation states. I don't know that we need to get into those levels of, it's almost name calling, but we do need to think through what constitutes agritourism in your respective state and what does not. And the way to do that, and the way I like to think about it, is what's really important here, and this is in law and in life, is that you give a really close reading to the terms used in the definition of agritourism. So words have meaning, right? And we need to attribute meaning to each of those words to determine if your absolutely brilliant idea for generating additional revenue fits into those categories or not. So I'm going to do that for you for Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania in the next 3 slides. This is Ohio's agritourism language, and the terms that we are going to have to attribute meaning to. I'm not going to read this for you, but I'm going to point out the terms that we need to attribute meaning to, and those include agriculturally related, which, think about that for a second. Agriculturally related. How is an activity agriculturally related? We'll think about that. We have to define what activity means. We have to attribute meaning to the word activity in this definition. And of course, as you can see, the word activity is conditioned by the descriptors educational, entertainment, historical, cultural, or recreational. And in a similar vein to the examples that are provided we can think of activities as UPIC operations or farm markets, right? So the state has told us that those examples are indeed agriculturally related activities. Another important term here is farm. So farm is an important term. It seems so obvious that, you know, what a farm might be, but we actually have to think about its meaning. And it is something very specific. So we'll talk about that. We have to think about the activity as allowing or inviting members of the general public. So who should we think about as the general public? And what does it mean to observe, participate in, or enjoy an activity? Frankly, just this small sentence, the definition of agritourism in Ohio, I think is absolutely exhausting. So we're going to go through each one of those terms and see what applies and how to think about this for the purpose of planning for revenue diversification through agritourism. Okay. Here's the same thing in West Virginia. I can, you know, declare this very proudly. I love West Virginia, not just because it is so beautiful, but also because of this definition. So in West Virginia, their statutory language is quite broad. We have to figure out what activity means. We have to figure out a little bit about, you know, who the general public might be. And then we just need to figure out, you know, what rural activities are, which sounds really like a really beautiful thing. So rural activities with recreational, entertainment, or educational purposes. And what does it mean to simply view or enjoy those things? So that's West Virginia's statute. And then Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, so typical of Pennsylvania. They have not yet even passed an agritourism bill, but we do have House Bill 1348, which is still pending. At least that's my understanding. It was proposed last year, and you can imagine why it's been held up a little bit. Who knows? Maybe they're waiting on William Penn to arise, you know, and help guide them. But here we are. Pennsylvania is still thinking through what agritourism might mean, and the current bill is very restrictive, very restrictive. It's got to be farm-related tourism or farm-related entertainment in Pennsylvania. And the bill seems to be restricting agritourism activities to involvement or entertainment in agricultural production, harvesting, or farm life. So that is much different than the Ohio and West Virginia statutes. And also, I didn't include it in the slide for you to view, but I'll also note for you that the bill, as it's currently proposed, explicitly excludes overnight accommodations, weddings, concerts, or provisions for food and beverage services. So Pennsylvania is really thinking of being limiting in terms of what could constitute agritourism. Okay, so those are our three states. Let's take a step back just for a second and think about why you would care, right? Why does it even matter that you could have an agritourism designation? Again, you know, we're thinking about new revenue streams. So having the designation of of one of the activities on your farm being agritourism can do multiple things for you. So it can increase your revenue, of course, and it can do that through the service that you're providing itself. So you can charge fees for the service. And most states, including Pennsylvania and Ohio, will include language in the statute about whether or not you can charge a fee. And in both Pennsylvania and Ohio, and of course Pennsylvania is still being considered, but at least in Ohio, the language clearly states that you can have these activities on your farm whether or not for a fee. So whether you charge a fee should not matter. So you can consider it as, so you could be considered agritourism whether or not you charge a fee. And remember that you are likely, and this is very important, in fact, you're likely increasing your revenue of farm product sales by having an audience on your farm in doing these activities. And tying those two revenue streams together can be a very important showing and a demonstration to show that you are agritourism. So we'll talk about that today. But the other reasons are, which are explicitly stated in each state statute, is that you would enjoy, as an agritourism operator, reduced local zoning interference, including limited applicability of the building code and use restrictions, meaning land use restrictions. And that's typical that farms would enjoy that kind of reduced local zoning interference. This becomes problematic. Local townships and municipalities are very uncomfortable with some of these activities happening in their jurisdiction without having any control. So that tends to be where we see conflicts. In addition, agritourism activities receive protection from civil liability for personal injury and or property damage. So that is very explicit in the statute. And that might be one of the major benefits. I think it's the major benefit, in addition to reduced local zoning interference, of having an agritourism designation under state law. So I don't go over this in the rest of the presentation, so I'll mention it now. Almost every state requires that you have a sign that says that you are an agritourism operation, and it has to be a sign that is very prominently placed and readable in terms of its size. Having that sign, at least in Ohio, is not required to enjoy reduction of local zoning interference. But it is required to show that you are able to enjoy protection from civil liability. So it does, and the best practice is to have the sign regardless of your goals. But I just want to point out that there is, the signage requirement is present, and the reason for it is to protect you from civil liability. So note that. Okay, so let's talk about these terms a little bit. And I'm going to revert to talking about Ohio just because there is a lot to work with in the Ohio definition of agritourism. And I think you can apply the same concepts that we're talking about in the Ohio terminology to the other statutes now that you know what they say. So I'm going to focus on Ohio, but please, in the Q&A, bring up questions about the other jurisdictions, and I'm happy to work through them with you. So Ohio requires agritourism to be conducted on a farm. What does that mean? And again, it seems so obvious, but it's not. So Ohio defines farm as something, if it's less than 10 acres, if it is 10 acres of agricultural production, then no question, it's a farm. So you're making hay on 10 acres, whatever agricultural production is occurring on 10 acres, as long as it is in full agricultural production, you should be considered a farm. Disputes tend to arise when we're talking about less than 10 acres. So if it's less than 10 acres of agricultural production, your ability to claim that your cool ideas for revenue diversification or agritourism are going to depend on how well you've kept track of revenue from sales of your agricultural products over the last few years. An easy way to demonstrate that you've met this requirement of $2,500 from agricultural production on 10 acres or less, and this is an average yearly gross income of $2,500, is if you've obtained the CAUV, which is an acronym. It's the current agricultural use value from the Ohio Department of Tax. So if you've obtained that, easy breezy, you're a farm. If not, then you need to be careful about how you're keeping track of receipts or another system for reliably accounting for your sales of farm products. So if you use the honor system, which is very common in paying for goods, that's totally fine. Great idea. I love that you're doing that. But you've got to be really careful that you're recording that revenue routinely as sales from agricultural production. So the tip here, if you haven't obtained the CAUV or have another system in place, is to start keeping track of your distinct sources of revenue. So, or plan to do that, right? So farm products versus services with a routine system of naming and accounting. And that should help you determine that you're a farm, or help someone else realize that you're a farm. Okay, here's where things start to get really difficult. And I should thank my friend Lizette for lending me her photo here. So what is an activity? In Ohio, activity just isn't defined. We know from the statutory language that the activity has to be agriculturally related, right? We know those descriptors: educational, entertainment, recreational, historical, and cultural, all of which we also need to define. Those descriptors go into what we understand an activity to be. And we know, of course, that the activity has to be conducted on a farm. But when a term is not defined in statute, we basically just have to rely on a dictionary definition of what that term means. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of activity, and there are like 5 of them. So I picked the one that I thought was most applicable. And it says a pursuit in which a person is active, or a form of organized, supervised, often extracurricular recreation. Which is not extraordinarily helpful as a definition. So it's quite broad, is my conclusion from the dictionary definition. It's quite broad. And I've been involved in cases where a township zoning board really wants to read into that word activity and impose implications such as a limited amount of time spent doing that particular task, or they want to read language into activity that is kind of akin to the U-Pick operation, so that it's kind of a one-off activity rather than a systematic visiting of the farm. So it's important, right, that you're thinking through what activity could mean and whether you're pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of what an activity might be. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. The reason I included this picture in particular is because weddings tend to be a good source of revenue in the area of agritourism. As we discussed, Pennsylvania is, the current proposal is to disallow weddings completely from agritourism. But we can discuss whether a wedding is squarely within the definition of an educational, entertainment, recreational, historic, or cultural activity for the Ohio definition. Perhaps it's entertainment. We could argue that, right? Perhaps it's cultural in that it's an event that allows us to kind of pursue shared values, practices that certainly characterize an important societal institution. But it's kind of difficult to think about how weddings might be. Maybe it's entertainment, I suppose, right? Maybe we could talk about it as recreation. It doesn't clearly fit within those descriptors for activity. But weddings are certainly something that agritourism providers tend to look to as potential revenue sources. Think about what a wedding could involve for a second. And in Ohio, I think we can likely include weddings within the definition of activity. Doesn't mean that it won't be a difficult enterprise, and I'll give you some advice later on how to think through pursuing this, pursuing weddings as agritourism on your farm. But what if you push the envelope toward, I don't know, a wedding being a week-long stay at the farm for guests? So, be careful about how far you're taking things, and if you're going to push things outside of kind of a comfort level of local zoning officials to encourage interference. It's important that you think about that for the purpose of planning. So weddings are an example to think about under this definition of our definition of activity. Another example to think about is education. And when I say education, you can think about education along a spectrum. Education could be educating people about what you're doing on the farm, inviting them to the farm for the purpose of educating them on, permaculture and design. But it could also be that you are hosting educational activities that perhaps are not agricultural education. So I'll pause for a minute to let you think about what that means. But the reason that I'm so focused on this is that I've had a recent case that deals with agritourism in schools. And I'll give you an example of some of the extreme statements that have been made in that context. The Board of Zoning Appeals official commenting on this particular case said something to the effect of the school on a farm was not agritourism because that would mean that a college campus on a farm with 10 acres in agricultural production could then be free from township or municipal zoning laws, which he believed was an absurd result. I don't know that it is, quite frankly, under the terms of the statute that Ohio has put out there. But the key here for educational activities is to try to understand the scope of what an activity is. So educational is clearly one of those descriptors in the definition of agritourism. So can the educational activity be a school that invites members of the public to enroll through tuition? Well, we're told under the statute that a fee doesn't matter, so tuition doesn't seem to be a problem, right? And so the language of the statute doesn't prohibit it, and the language seems to be quite broad. But the way to think about this is that, again, language matters, and it should matter in your marketing and planning materials, so in your business plan. Why does it matter that the education is happening on a farm? Be explicit about that in your marketing materials and in your business planning materials. Is the educational programming helping your farm product sales? Or is that even a goal of yours? If it is, then describe how. And that's the easiest way, quite frankly, to tie an activity to agriculture, a clear boost in revenue from the activity itself. And I'm talking about revenue in farm product sales in addition to revenue from the activity. And if you can link those two things, so every time you're having, this educational activity, you see a boost in your sales, that's going to be the easiest way to tie it to agricultural, to make it agriculturally related, right? But that doesn't have to be the case. I'm just saying that's the easy way. You can be, just quite diligent about making sure that you're describing why the activity on the farm matters, why it matters that it's on the farm, right? So that's the best way to think about it. Recreational activities is another area where agritourism, of course, Ohio uses recreation as one of those descriptors. But the language is unclear. Again, this is another question about how agriculturally related does it have to be? Does it have to be that, the goats are doing yoga with you. I don't think that's the case, and it seems almost absurd that that would be the case. But again, you have to be clear about that, and about how you're tying the event, the recreational event, to the farm in your marketing materials and your business planning materials, and how you're presenting, on the farm, your introduction to the event. It's important to tie it to the context of the farm. So think about what you're calling your yoga events. Are you using farm in literally the title of the event? That could be helpful. Are you making it clear that the context of the farm is important for the event? How are you making that clear? I mean, do the sounds present at the farm make a difference? I would think they do. Does the quietness, make a difference? So in your advertising materials, make sure you're using language that makes the farm context clearly important to the recreational activity. Describe the why of the farm. And again, if your goal is to get more people to your farm stand through these activities, then draw a clear line between advertising farm products to that group and potentially the revenue increases in agricultural product sales due to your event's occurrence. Okay, so how do you do this? My preference is that you do this by developing relationships. So it's really critical that you don't just plan agritourism in isolation. Involve members of your community in the planning process. Show your excitement about this. Show why it's so important that the farm is the place where these things are happening. And do that in a way that, you're doing it in all kinds of different community contexts. So talk to your neighbors about it. Talk about your plans with your local officials. Obtain their support. Get the support of local businesses. Be very public about your plans. So don't sit on them and suddenly reveal your announcement. It's best to get buy-in in advance. And please do it prior to any kind of design and construction of buildings on your farm. And if you haven't done that, so if you're an audience member who has already constructed something or already designed something, it's not too late. So start talking to people about that and, tell them why it's important. I think it's important to think through how to involve people early and often in obtaining these agritourism designations. I'll tell you why. I have included the why in the next slide after this one, so just give me 1 second and we'll jump to that. But it's important. The expense and method of constructing buildings is something I want you to think about in your planning process as well. That could change, right? How you're going to go about the design and the expense involved could change based on whether the building code applies in full, or as your barn is just agriculture or just agritourism in your operations. Maybe the building code doesn't apply. The fire code probably does apply, so be careful about that. You want to make sure that you are thinking through having a certain number of people in your barn or other gathering places, maybe even a kitchen that you have set up or other food preparation facilities. If you have regular occurrences of a lot of people in those facilities, you probably do need to think about at least the fire code and possibly occupancy permits. So don't fall into the trap of assuming that because you're a farm, your activities are unregulated. You should probably accept that you will be regulated to some degree, and that's okay. I think once you're able to accept that and you're able to work with, neighbors, state and local governments, and make sure that you're thinking through these definitions clearly and have their buy-in to your understanding of the definitions we just went over. That's the work of community democracy. And that's why I think it's so important to go through this today. So working together to allow the development of community wealth is something that you're never going to do in isolation. So yeah, I mentioned that I wanted you to think through the definitions so that you're planning. I also want you to think through those definitions because they could be better. And you could interact with your local and state officials in a way that makes sure that what you need is part of the law. Maybe if not today, maybe we can clarify some of those definitions to make sure that weddings, to the degree that you would want them to be considered agritourism, are indeed included. So that's the work of community democracy, and that's the work that I hope that you feel empowered to do based on the way that we just went through analyzing the language that's currently in the statute. So with that, I'll pass it back to Josh and let you guys ask questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. I'm curious, does anyone here in a situation that where they could be using this advice, that either owning a farm or working with individuals that own a farm?
I hope I didn't discourage anyone from doing it. It's fun stuff to plan it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we have anyone that wants to jump up and ask questions, and that's
totally fine.
Fine, yeah. If you think of anything, obviously Emily's email is right here at the bottom of the screen, and phone number. Please feel free to reach out to us. That's part of this, is that, a lot of this is personal information and personal situations, so we're happy to help you with those too.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Emily, for putting this all together, wrapping up the long week of webinars, and excited to get all this up. And if if you want to share this with friends, we'll have all of this online on YouTube shortly, and we'll be sending out an email to everyone who's registered for the events. And please share this widely. We know that not everyone has time to sit through this during the workday, so we want to make sure this is accessible to as many people as possible. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar series. Looking forward to doing more of this stuff in the future. And have a great weekend too. It's Friday, so I know the weather's not great here in Pittsburgh, but I'm hoping it clears up.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.